Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air magazine. If you want to learn how to paint pets in watercolor, today is your day. I've got a great new sample video for you from Shelley Pryor.
Hi, I'm Shelley Pryor, and welcome to my workshop. Today we're going to be covering how to paint a cat in watercolor. So let's get into some of the materials that we'll be using today. I'm going to start with 2 water containers, one for clean water, one for rinse. I have a large palette with plenty of mixing area. I'm also going to be softening my paints using a pipette. So I add quite a bit of water to each of my wells in order to soften up my color so that my paint is saturated right through, not just the top. I will be using a large squirrel hair brush. I have a 1-inch synthetic brush, flat. I have an assortment of small rounds. I'm also going to be using a dip pen. This one I will be using for masking. I will be using a stylus, the pipette. I have a kneaded eraser, liquid soap, a spray bottle, and masking fluid. To remove my masking, I will be using a pickup tool. This is a crepe tool. It is called a pickup rubber cement eraser. Paper towel. I use a palette knife, which I will get into later. Masking tape. I have Arches 140-pound cold press paper that I will be using. I will pre-stretch this onto gator board. Sometimes it's called watercolor board. I will be using a regular standard stapler. Okay, so let's get into how to stretch the paper. Okay, I'm going to start with my gator board. Gator board is sometimes referred to as watercolor board. It looks a lot like foam board, but it is a little bit different. This one's a little bit stained, but it doesn't matter. It's actually got a very hard veneer on both sides. You can hear the difference. So I'm going to use this to staple onto. I'm going to use a sponge and some water and my stapler. Now this is just a regular office stapler. So I'm going to open it up like this. And I'll place my paper on my board. And I'm going to start getting my paper nice and wet. And I want to fully saturate the paper. So I'm going to be very generous with my water here. My paper is 100% cotton, so it's going to be very absorbent. I mean, just think about how absorbent your jeans would be. It will hold a tremendous amount of water. So I'm very lightly touching the paper. Normally I would place it in a sink and just soak it for about 3 minutes at room temperature, and I'll want to soak both sides. So I flip it over, and I'm going to continue to wet the paper. And you can see there's actually quite a lot of water here. And I'm waiting to the point where all the fibers are full of water to the point where they really don't hold anymore. I'm not scrubbing the paper, you can see that. It's very important because the paper has a starch sizing on it. The sizing is what helps control the absorption of paint, and I don't want to remove that. Otherwise, it's a little bit like painting on paper towel. So I'm just going to let this soak in, and you can see the paper is starting to get a little bit limp here. I'm going to flip it over one more time. and continue wetting. And if your paper has a watermark on it, you would want that right facing, so reading correctly. So I'm going to continue to wet this. There we go. And I'm going to make sure that it is reasonably squared up on my board. And now I will take my stapler. Make sure you have enough staples in your stapler. And I'm going to allow this part to hang off of the edge of the paper, or off the edge of the table. So I'm going to start in the corner, and you see where my finger is? I'm actually using this as a guide to run along the side of my gator board so that I don't have to line up every single staple. Then I turn my board and continue. Now I'm placed about 1 staple per inch, so if this piece of paper were 11 inches, there'd be approximately 11 staples there. And then I will just leave that overnight or several hours until it's completely dried again. Just like cotton, just like your jeans, this is going to shrink, and then you'll have a very nice flat painting by the time you're done. So now let's get into the painting. Okay, and now on to the most important part of the project, the subject. So we are going to be working with a cat. I have a good reference picture here. What I like about this reference is the lighting. And we have a very strong light source coming from the left-hand side, very established shadows on the right-hand side, which give us form and interesting values to work with. So this is already a very good reference image. I don't need to edit it. When you have a good photo, then you can just go straight to your drawing. I have enlarged this to the size that I want to paint. So with my actual size photograph, I have it taped on the left-hand side so that it opens like a book. And underneath, I've placed a piece of gray graphite paper. This is a wax-free graphite paper, and I will just use my stylus to transfer my main lines. So I will come around each of these shapes, dividing all of the values, and when you transfer your design, do a line, check underneath, make sure it's not too dark, and adjust your pressure accordingly. I have most of this already transferred, but there's a few lines that I want to add. So just to show you how this works, I'm going to use the larger end of my stylus, not a lot of pressure, and I just want to outline this window and maybe this woodwork. I'm not going to transfer every line, just a few here for guideline. There's a line here on the side. I have to move this over a little bit. And now we're ready to paint. Okay, now that we have transferred the drawing, it's time to get into the masking. I've secured my paper once more with some masking tape, but now we need to mask the actual white areas of our painting. So I'm going to be using liquid masking fluid, which is essentially a liquid latex concoction. And I have placed mine in a smaller jar. This one actually comes white, but I have tinted it by adding a couple of drops of cobalt blue to it. So your masking fluid should be nice and runny, should not be thick and gummy. It needs to be fresh. And let's look at what needs to be masked. So I'm going to be looking at whiskers, obviously on the face, but also in the ears. And that's mostly it. I don't think I want to accentuate anything else, so I just really need to save some of those whiskers. And even though the fur is pretty light behind this, I still need to save these whiskers. Okay, and I think that's it. I think I will just allow this to dry. All right, before we get on to the first wash, let's decide what colors we're going to be using. So I'm looking at my reference, and I'm seeing some cerulean blue. The cerulean blue I'm using is actually a hue, which is a little less granulating. And I'm going to pull that out into my mixing area. I see a little bit of cobalt blue. I want to get all of these colors prepared before I start going into wetting my paper. I want to have this ready before I put the water on so that I can jump right into my paint. So raw sienna, I have a little bit of sepia. And I'm going to use a little bit of Payne's Gray. And I'm going to make these colors a little bit darker than I think I'm going to actually need, because if I'm going to wet my paper first, that's going to dilute it a little bit further. So some permanent rose. And that's going to be my palette. Little burnt sienna as well, I think. Burnt sienna. Okay, so there's the colors I'm going to be using. And now I'm going to wet my paper. So for wetting my paper, I'm going to be using a large squirrel hair brush. This is a number 6. Clean water. And I'm going to start at the top. I am working flat. I will come close to my lines, but not completely to them. It's a little harder to control a large brush, so I don't want to overlap my subject here. And in looking at my reference, the back end of the cat here is very soft, so I'm going to wet this area here because I actually want some of my background to flow into the cat. Now I'll come down the side. And around the face, everything's a little bit crisp, so I'm not going to overlap there, but the chest area, the fur is very soft, so I will bring some of the water into the cat here to keep that area soft. The edge of the paw is very crisp, so I will come up close to that and keep the paw dry. So basically, any place that I want to keep a crisper edge, I'm leaving it dry. Anywhere that I want a softer edge, I'm bringing the water in. Okay, so I will redistribute this water to make sure it's even throughout. It's not puddled anywhere or high spots that are dry. And I will switch to a smaller round to help bring some of this water up to the lines and get a little more accuracy. So I'm bringing it around the ear here and around the ear on this side. and around this paw. All right, now it's time to start adding the color. I'm going to start with my lighter colors first. I'm going to start with some cerulean here, mix a little bit of cobalt into it, and I'm actually going to add a little bit of Payne's gray to this so that it's not too brilliant blue. I want to dull it down a little bit, so the Payne's gray will dull that color slightly. I want to keep it a light value, and I'm still using this number 8 round brush, but I could certainly use a larger one if I needed to. And I'm going to paint this large windowsill here. With the wet surface, this is all going to melt together, and I will have it fairly seamless in terms of brush marks. I won't have any. Coming carefully around the paw, down the side of the couch, and to the bottom of the windowsill. I will work quickly because I don't have a tremendous amount of time before things start to dry, but I'm going to use a little bit of permanent rose, which is a little bit bright, so I'm going to add some raw sienna to it, make it a little bit warmer, and add that up here in this corner. I don't want to make it too dark, so make sure I adjust the amount of water I'm using to the correct value. I kind of think of painting on watercolor paper as a little bit like I'm painting on a light table, right, where I want to have the white of the paper showing through. Let's see, I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna down here at the bottom, but again, I want to have not too much brilliance in my paint. So I'm coming in here with burnt sienna along the bottom of the windowsill. I'm going to use a little sepia in this to darken it. There we go. And now the area around the cat itself, and that's going to be mainly Payne's gray. So I'm going to start establishing this window frame, and if I want to get a little bit of control over this without it bleeding too much, I'll blot my brush to create this straighter line here. And as I come in towards the cat and that nice soft fur, I'm going to give a little bit of flick to my brush so that I get a little bit of softening there. Large area I can just paint with the side of my brush. And then use a little flick to bring it into to create the fur texture. All right, so I'm creating a little bit of softness there. Top of the ear is very straight. But I'm using a soft brush and a light touch so that I don't get a halo effect. The paint should flow on the surface. Coming in here with some dark. I want a nice dark value behind this cat so it really emphasizes those nice highlights and that beautiful sun. The sun is really what I want to capture here in this picture. It's got such a peaceful, happy feeling. I'm coming back to the back haunches of the cat at this point. Whoops. And I want to just stop my Payne's gray there. Everything's wet, so everything's still flowing nicely. A little spot there, just pull that up. And I want to clean up the edge of this windowsill a little bit here. So I'm going to go back to my blue, blot my brush, and just run that down in a straighter line. I'm not really looking for a crisp line, I just want a straighter line. Let's add a little bit more color there. There we go. And there's a little bit of detail on the windowsill here. I'm going to use this, some combination of blue and the Payne's gray to create this. Just hint at some of those details. There we go. This is going to be a very out of focus background, which helps us focus on the cat. And actually, that's the way our eyes work. If we were focusing on the cat, we would not see this background in focus. A little bit of light on that windowsill, so I'm leaving some of that area white. And now I've got a couple of lines here that I just want to imply the windowsill. I'm going to use a little bit of my raw sienna for some of this. Blot it on my paper towel because I want my brush drier than my surface. Okay, so I'm just hinting at some of the woodwork there, and I'm going to leave this to dry. Okay, now that the background washes are dry, I can go on to the cat. So I'm going to begin with the ear, and I will wet the area first. Clean water. My brush does not need to be quite as wet since it's a smaller section. And for this, I'm going to be using a little bit of permanent rose, which by itself is a little bit too bright. So I'm going to add a little bit of raw sienna to that. And fairly diluted because it's a very light value. Blot my brush and try it out. A little more raw sienna, I think. That's better. And remember that if you have color that looks like it's too dark, it's not going to stay that dark when it's dry. It will end up being lighter. Blot my brush. Just going to lift a little bit out of there so that I have a transition from a little bit more color here to a little less color on the left. All right, so I'm going to wet the right ear, clean water, and you'll notice I'm leaving a little white rim around the ear. A little white fur around the edge of the ear I will keep dry. So I'm coming into this area here. Same coloring. And I'm making special note of where the ear is lighter. So it's lighter on the left, a little bit more color on the right. As I come down to the ear canal, it starts to really get quite a bit more color there. It also gets a little bit darker, so I'm going to add a little bit of Payne's gray to that. And that has darkened that down, making it look like it recedes into the ear. Okay. There we go. Now I'm going to work somewhere other than right beside those wet areas. I will come to the back haunches here where we have some darker color here on the markings of the cat. So I'm going to use clean water and wet this section. I'm often wetting a section before I add the color in so that the paint will melt a little bit and give me more softness. So for this back area, there's a little bit of burnt sienna. Burnt sienna by itself might be a little bit bright, so I'm going to use a little tiny bit of sepia with this, starting at the back of the head and just adding little bits in there. Always putting on my color in the direction of the fur growth. Then I will get into some of the darker fur, and for this I'll be using some Payne's gray. So I'm going to pick it up on my brush, blot it, try it out, make sure that it's not going to bleed too far. And I'm still stroking on these markings with the tip of my brush in the direction of the fur. Now I see a little bit of a spot here where it's a little bit on the dry side. So I'm going to pick up this synthetic brush, my flat, and I'm going to blot it. This is now a damp brush, so I will use this and soften that little spot. Come back to my Payne's gray and start adding in a little more color. Remember that if it looks right when it's wet, it's not going to dry the correct value. It will end up being a little bit too light. So you have to kind of overcompensate for that drying, lightening. That whole process where watercolor gets lighter as it dries. But this area here is nice and soft, which makes it look like it's a little bit further away. It's creating a little bit of perspective. I'm going to come back now to my flat synthetic brush, clean water, blot it just so that it doesn't have too much water in it. And I'm going to work around this eye here. So I'm going to dampen this whole section. Clean water. And I'm just dampening that one section where I'm working. I'm going to be using a little bit of burnt sienna, a little bit of sepia here. Blot it on my paper towel so that it's not wetter than my surface. And using strokes that are very similar to the growth of the fur, so short, quick strokes, I'm going to start adding in some of this marking that's happening on the cat around the face. I have a little hair in there, and I'm just going to allow the paper to dry before I try to remove that. If you try to remove lint and hair and things like that from your watercolor while it's wet, you may end up messing up your wash. So I just let it dry, and then I come back and remove it. Just brush away when it's dry, so there's no need to be concerned about it. And if I have any of these lines that I'm adding on right now, if anything looks a little too harsh, I just come back to my flat synthetic brush, and with a feather touch, I just give it a really quick softening. Hi, I'm Shelley Pryor, and welcome to my workshop. Today we'll be painting a watercolor cat. In this video, I'll be teaching you how to create a very soft, out-of-focus background, save very fine white whiskers, and create the soft effect of fur. I'll be showing my two-brush technique to create softness with control. I'll help you solve the challenge of getting the right values with a simple homemade tool. I noticed that a lot of beginners worry too much about the details. I'm going to show you how to simplify that process. The struggle I see that many artists have is that they treat the entire painting with the same attention. I'm going to show you ways to soften some areas to allow the eye to flow more easily through the whole painting. If you're having trouble with soft textures or creating realism, this video is for you. This will inspire students to build layers at a comfortable pace. So join me as we paint this cat in the sun using soft texture and detail.
That's Painting Pets in Watercolor with Shelley Pryor. You can learn more about it at painttube.tv. And remember, we have a special discount code for you up in the comments section. Now let's get right to our interview with Shelley. Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air magazines. Welcome to Interviews with the Artist. Today we have an incredible world-renowned watercolor artist, Shelley Pryor. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Eric.
So we have a lot to talk about. We have watercolor to talk about. We have your art career. Where did this all begin for you?
Well, if we're going right back to the beginning, it was probably my grandmother who encouraged me. She just told me I'm going to grow up to be an artist. And
Really?
yeah. And I always enjoyed it. I come from a big family, so I liked that alone time. So I would spend a lot of time drawing and coloring in my room just for the peace and quiet, I guess.
So did you have at the time what your grandmother may have perceived to have natural talent, or was she just being encouraging?
Well, I think all grandmothers are encouraging, but of course as a child you're going to take it to heart.
Yeah.
But I think when I got to high school, I was very keen on art, and I actually had my art teacher offer to purchase one of my pieces. So that to me was like, wow, I was so excited.
Did you sell it?
I did.
Yeah, how much did you get?
I think I got $35 for it.
Well, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
$35 back then, and also when you're in high school, that's pretty cool.
Yes.
So what happens from high school in the pursuit of your art career? Did you really consider that you were going to be a full-time artist at that point?
Oh, absolutely I did. Yes.
You did.
I actually went into animation, classical animation, for a couple of years, and originally Disney was going to set up house in Toronto, and there was going to be lots of job opportunities there. Then they changed their mind, and I was finding that I really wasn't that interested in painting the same thing over and over again. So I decided that I wanted to go into fine art. So then I went to Dundas Valley School of Art, and I took their foundation program.
What does that mean?
It's basically an overall program where you kind of learn all mediums and all areas of art. You know, some history, some
So all
technical
the
work.
foundational principles of anything that you might encounter.
Exactly, exactly.
And then how long was that?
That was a one-year course.
Okay.
Yeah, that was a one-year program, full-time. And of course, you don't come out of art school and just suddenly you're an artist. I had to supplement my income with an actual job afterwards. I worked as a graphic artist for a while. Yes, I did, for a print company. And I went on to another company after that and worked for several years. Yeah.
So there was a point at which, though, you decided you're going to be a full-time artist.
Yes.
And how did you make that transition out of this period of time when you were working a job and you were now going in to become a full-time artist? Did you start trying to sell things and learn how to sell things before you transitioned out? How did that all work?
Well, I think for any artist starting out, I think you almost need to have a support system of some kind, because you need a backup plan for, you know, if you don't, it's not a get-rich-quick scheme, that's for sure. So I had started my family, so I'd basically taken a pause from working for somebody else at that point anyway. And before getting back into that, I had already started trying to do shows and sell my work independently. And I joined groups and started getting more involved in the art community at that point.
Now, you're also raising children.
Yes.
How many kids?
I have 2 daughters.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so we hear a lot of stories from a lot of artists about how they dealt with all of that. How did you deal with it? Because I don't know about you, but I assume, like most artists, it's like a day without painting is like a day without nourishment or blood or whatever.
Exactly.
So how did you deal with that when you had kids?
I made my kids do art. So we did art together.
Nice.
And I did a lot after they went to bed or when they were napping, whenever I could fit it in, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you eventually then, are the kids grown now?
Yes,
yeah.
yes. They are 35 and 36.
Wow, do you have any grandbabies?
One on the way in May.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah, so it is.
And so once the kids left the house, were you already kind of in this professional mode and selling art, or were you waiting for them to get out?
No. I think when they were in high school and even senior public school, I think at that point I was already pretty immersed in my art and the community of art. Once they became a little bit more independent, I took back a little bit more of mine.
Yeah.
So I was able to get a little bit more involved. And so I guess I eased into it.
Talk to me about the community of art, because you mentioned that earlier, and the idea that you started getting involved in the community. Tell us why that's important and how that will help guide other artists who might be watching this, who would be interested in kind of figuring out how to have a career.
Oh my gosh, well, it's so important to seek out other artists. I mean, I can't put enough emphasis on it, because you cannot learn in a vacuum. You need other artists to learn from. You need a broad range of people to learn from in order to expand your own skills, to be inspired, and just for the camaraderie. So I originally started out when I couldn't really get into the art community. I would go to the library and I would take out books, and I would watch videos, and I would go online and watch things, and I decided to join some groups in the evenings and attend their meetings and find out what they were all about. And through those groups, and I think when you're involved in a group like that, you're definitely going to get exposure to opportunities, you know, art shows and things like that. So unless you are part of a community, you really don't know what's going on.
Well, I also have found that those people give you the motivation.
Oh.
You know, they're kind of the ones who are kind of giving you the encouragement. When I was thinking about starting Plein Air magazine, I was studying with Camille Preswadik, the colorist, and I was kind of on the fence about whether or not I was going to do it. And she's like, "You should do this. You should do this," and we need that. And you know, we're all a little bit insecure when we first start painting.
Absolutely.
And you need other artists who are willing to say, "Hey, you're good enough, you know, it's time to fly out of the nest." Or you also need other artists to say, "Hey, wait a minute, back off just a little bit, you're not ready for that." So that's where that community comes in handy, I would assume.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. You find out the opportunities, and yes, you know, you support each other. You know, you do become supportive of each other, and you learn from each other, and you just have to be part of it.
So I'm going to ask you a completely insane, silly question. And it's insane and silly because to you it's part of your everyday life. But there's somebody watching this who wants to know, what's it like to live the life of an artist?
Oh.
I mean, is it just a regular life, like you go to work in 9 to 5, or is there, what's it really like for them, for you?
Well, in my case, it is. It's a full-time occupation. It doesn't feel like a job, though, because I love it.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't feel like a job, and I think that's the big difference between creating art and working for somebody else creating art. Or creating graphics or whatever the case may be. I think it's really important to, you know, follow your own path and, you know, just really get out there and put yourself out. It's hard to put yourself out there. But as an artist, I think you learn to see the world differently. I really do. I go for walks with friends, and they're walking and talking about, you know, having coffee in the afternoon, and I'm walking with them, and I'm thinking, oh, I love the bark on that tree. So, you know, I think I see the world a lot differently now than a lot of other people do.
Well, as artists, we do. I mean,
yeah.
You know, I'm sure you're like me. You're driving down the road and you see this incredible color in the sky, and you're either trying to remember how you would paint it or think about how you would paint it, or you're trying to get a picture or something. You know, my wife accuses me of driving and photographing being dangerous, which it probably is. So,
Yeah.
you know, that's probably how I'll go. You know, I'll be taking a picture.
Oh, I hope not.
So, yeah, I hope not too. You mentioned something else that I think is really critical for people to understand, and that is it's a full-time job. And meaning that as an artist who has to make a living, you have a responsibility to yourself to produce enough work to be able to make a living. And that means you're in the studio as if you were showing up at a regular job.
Yes, although I am a very active instructor. So a lot of my days are not in the studio. They are out there teaching at different locations, or more recently online, and giving instruction to other people, training other people, and teaching them how to use watercolor.
But that's part of how you make your living.
It is, absolutely.
So you are disciplined in the sense that, you know, you're spending the amount of time you need to spend to generate income, whether it's creating paintings or creating, you know, teaching people and so on, which is really critically important. What do you learn when you teach?
I think I learn just about as much from my students as they do from me. They inspire me so much. Sometimes I'll try to encourage somebody to put their own twist on it. And I'll see them do something that I never considered.
Right.
You know, they surprise me sometimes. And as much as possible, I do try to make sure that they don't become a clone, that they put their own personality and their own, you know, their own preferences into their paintings. Online, we've been working more the same type of thing together, like, you know, we'll all paint this particular thing, because we don't have as much two-way communication as we do in person. But in person, it's amazing for me to be able to look over somebody's shoulder and see what they're doing, and sometimes they're bringing to my class ideas that they picked up from another instructor. So it doesn't matter what medium you work in, they sort of cross-pollinate each other, and you can learn.
Do you work in only one medium, or do you work in others?
I work in several mediums. I work in oil and acrylic, even colored pencil, some pastel, graphite, but I would say probably watercolor 90% of the time.
Yeah, but I want to probe that, because I think that's also something that is important to understand. I'm finding this more and more. As you know, we do these virtual online conferences like Plein Air Live, Realism, Pastel, Watercolor, etc. And what I have found personally from that experience, because I'm primarily an oil painter like you're primarily a watercolorist, I have found that first off, I'm more enthusiastic about my oil painting when I start painting in watercolor or acrylic or something else, because it's just different. It's making me more enthusiastic, but it's also informing my work. I was watching one of the instructors on the last Watercolor Live, and they did something that was a watercolor technique, and I thought, I wonder if that would work in oil. So I went home that night, and I tried that technique in oil, and I can't imagine any oil painter ever having done it, but it worked beautifully.
It did.
And I also think that it just makes us more, I don't know, more well-rounded, more interesting, more, I don't know, it just seems to make us more enthusiastic about all kinds of art.
Yeah, I think you're right. You know, imagine if you were a cook and you only had certain ingredients in your kitchen all the time. Wouldn't it be a treat to have a new ingredient?
Right.
To cook with, right?
Or a new style of cooking, you know,
exactly.
a new ethnic food or something, Ethiopian that you've never tried.
New spices.
New spices.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why watercolor? Why is watercolor your primary?
That's interesting, because in college, watercolor was my worst. I'm not what you would call talented.
Do you think anybody really is?
I think if you are talented, your talent doesn't lie in the skill. Your talent lies in the passion.
Bingo.
Yes.
Bingo. Because that's what I've learned as well, is that talent is really the people who are willing just to keep pushing through.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. It was my nemesis in college.
Really?
Absolutely.
And yet you're one of the great watercolorists today.
Well, I had given up for maybe 8 years. I didn't pick up any watercolors.
What were you painting in?
A little bit. I was doing more drawing probably at that point,
right.
And I didn't really pick up any watercolors, but I always loved how it looked.
Yeah.
And so I just kept looking through magazines and seeing all these beautiful glowing watercolors, and I thought, I just got determined one day, and I said, darn it, I am going to learn this. And right that day, I went to the library, I took out books, I rented videos, I signed up for some other classes, I joined a group, and I thought, I am going to learn this. And I think it has more to do with your determination and passion than it does with your skill. I think skill can be learned, and you need some patience to learn it all, because, you know, it's not a short process. You know, you have to put the miles on your brushes.
Yeah, so this is a dialogue that we get involved in all the time, and that is that you can learn to paint fast, but you can't paint well fast.
Right.
Right, and that's the distinction. In other words, you can watch a video having never done it, and you've learned the process, and then you have to practice it and practice it and practice it, and kind of the same thing with an instructor is the more feedback you can get from that instructor, the more they can give you some, dare I say, correction, correction on drawing, or hey, you got a little too much black here, or too much white here, or whatever. Those things lead you to where you need to be.
Yeah.
But I think there's a myth. The myth is practice makes perfect. And practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanence. Mm-hmm. Perfect practice makes perfect. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yes.
And that's why having the ability to study under somebody like you is so much better than being self-taught, right? Because, I mean, that's kind of a badge of courage for a lot of people is they like, hey, I'm self-taught, and there's nothing wrong with that. But being self-taught also probably means you burned lots of years that you didn't need to burn figuring things out when you could have studied under you and said, oh, I've been trying to figure that out for years, and you're like, okay, just do this, right?
Yeah. Well, it's like I said, when I learned from my students, they come up with things that didn't occur to me.
Yeah.
You don't know what you don't know.
Right.
Right. You don't even know what there is that you don't know.
That's called incompetent incompetence.
But yeah, I think that putting the miles in also helps you determine what your style is going to be as well, like which direction you like.
You've just opened up another door. So that's the biggest question I get from my readers is, how do I develop a style? Can you answer that question?
Well, I think it's whatever you steer towards, but I think your style sort of exists inside of you, and it finds you more than you find it. It was quite interesting to me that somebody said, I recognized your painting right away. And I thought, you did? And they said, yeah, it was definitely your style. And I'm like, oh, I have a style? I wasn't even aware.
Right.
But apparently I do.
Well, style is a calligraphy in a sense.
Yeah.
It's like your signature. It's just, when we were kids, we'd practice our signature over and over, and then all of a sudden it just kind of became this. And I think the same thing. I worked for years trying to figure out how do I develop a style, and then somebody pointed out the same thing. You already have your style, and it's just because, you have your way of approaching things, and everybody looks different. A style can be a real fabulous benefit to an artist. Because it's just who you are. But it also, when I'm judging art shows, sometimes I don't need to see the signature. I'll say, that's definitely a Shelley Pryor, or that's definitely a Thomas Schaller, or, et cetera.
Yes.
And so that's the only time it actually might benefit or it might hurt you. You just never know. But I think that it just kind of, I agree. I think it finds you, and but when does it find you? How long does it take? Is that a lifelong thing, or is it just all of a sudden you're making your brush strokes kind of the same way all the time? Is it just a habit thing?
I think it has to be a combination, because I think you try to emulate people you admire, and that can have a tremendous amount of influence. But yes, your actual, the way you take a brush and the way you turn it as you apply the paint does become your own. Just the way music suits a particular musician, right? Eventually, like a jazz player doesn't start out being a jazz player. They usually try on everything, but they really enjoyed this particular way of playing.
It's a great
example. It's similar in painting, I think.
Who do you admire? Who do you, I won't get into contemporary artists because that's a slippery slope because there's so many. But if you looked throughout history, what artists really get you excited?
Oh, there's so many. I like Van Gogh, I like Sargent, I don't know, there's so many, Homer, there's so many. And because they're all so unique, it's really hard to say I like one over another, because it's like comparing apples to oranges. You know, they're all a little bit different. And thank goodness artists are. I think being all different is what makes art interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there one question, if you could, you know, when you find yourself opening up in the pearly gates and you go, oh, well, there's Winslow Homer and there's John Singer Sargent and there's, you know, whomever, is there one question that you would have for one of those artists?
Probably, can we go paint together? You know, I would love to just look over their shoulders painting. I would love to see that.
Nobody's ever given me that answer. And that's a great answer, because you really get the answers by observing.
Yes.
Right?
Well, we're visual people.
Yeah. So you have had, and that's the benefit of workshops or watching videos or other things like that, because you get to observe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there somebody like really iconic that you've had a chance to watch paint in person?
Several, actually. I have, well, when I was growing up in high school, I guess one of my influences at that time, Robert Bateman is a world-renowned wildlife artist. And he is also from my town, was teacher at my school. And
Really?
he was just coming into his fame at that point.
And probably nobody locally had any idea that he was world-renowned.
Well, he got his start when I was in high school.
Yeah.
And it just exploded for him. And you know, being from our town, of course, we were very proud of him, and he had a tremendous success. And of course, I admired that, and I admired his style of painting. He was unique at the time. I have taken from quite a few different artists.
Did you get a chance to see him paint?
I have painted with him, yes.
You have painted with him?
Yes, I have painted with him.
Wow,
a couple of times. There's been some workshops of his. He does come back to town every once in a while, and he doesn't offer that many workshops now. He lives out in British Columbia, so but when he does come out here, he will occasionally have a workshop, and I'm not going to miss the opportunity.
So what is your best advice to somebody who has never painted before? They might be watching this, they maybe haven't yet even convinced themselves that they can do it, because there's that whole insecurity thing that a lot of us face at the beginning of, well, you have to have talent. What's your best advice to somebody to get rolling and to get to a point where you feel like you're proficient?
Well, in my case, it was a matter of just getting determined, be patient with it, because it's going to take a while. It's interesting because I had recently shown some of my students. I had been promising it for a long time, but I said, I'm going to show you some of the paintings that I did 20 years ago so that you won't feel so discouraged with your own work. And I showed it to them, and they kind of said, yeah, okay, I feel better. So yeah, I mean, it's not a quick process. You do need to give yourself time and patience. Don't expect, we're kind of in an instant pudding world where we want everything right away, and art is a slower build than that. So you do need patience, and give yourself permission to fail, because I think you learn as much from your failures as your success.
Well, and I would just pile on that by saying, and you're painting, you're having fun. Even if you're struggling, you're having fun, right? And when you play, you learn. And
Yes.
when you screw things up, you learn. You know, so be playful and have fun, and just don't look at everything as so precious. One of my instructors in oil walked up to my canvas. I had been in a class. I'd been painting on this painting for 6 or 8 weeks, Saturdays. Mm-hmm. He walked up to my class and he said, "It's all wrong," and he just started scraping. And
oh my gosh.
I was disturbed.
I bet.
And he knew I was disturbed, and he said, "You've got to learn to understand that your painting isn't precious. What's most important is to get it right." And he said, "You could not fix this because your drawing was so far off. I couldn't come up and just make a couple corrections and fix it. You had to start from scratch." And that was such an important lesson for me.
I have to agree with you on that. And particularly in watercolor, I mean, sometimes you get to the point of no return, and you cannot recover. If it gets muddy, you're done. And you're right. You have to give yourself permission to play. And the only failure is not trying.
So what would you hope that 50 or 100 years from now, assuming you're not with us anymore, what would you hope that people think about or say about you and your artwork as an artist?
Well, I hope that they feel that I was able to share something with them that helped them in their work. I like to pass along whatever I have. It's not like the secret recipe that I have to keep to myself. I've always felt like, I'm going to tell you all the things that I wished had been told to me when I was learning so that I could learn more easily. And I hope that when I'm gone, that people will say, well, I've got this lesson that I got from her, and it has helped me.
Okay, so let's start a philosophical discussion based on that point.
Okay.
By the way, I totally agree with you.
Oh, good.
My instructor said to me, his instructors withheld information over 10 or 15 or 20 years that he had to struggle to learn, and he didn't want to force us to go through that. But then there's this question of, it's like, how much do we give our kids, and do we give our kids too much, and do they appreciate it? And it's kind of the same thing with artists. There's a certain amount of struggle that your students need to get and need to go through to be able to make sure that they lock those lessons in their brain. So that's where I have a question. I mean, I don't really know the right answer, but it's like, well, if I give you everything and I make everything easy for you, that's a beautiful gift. And I guess if they get there and they learn it and they understand it, why not? But at the same time, there's a certain amount of struggle we all need. What do you think?
I think you're right. I think there is a certain amount of struggle. And I do think that you learn as much from your own mistakes as what you are taught. An instructor can pass along all their wisdom, but you still need to pick up the brush and make those mistakes for those, to be ingrained and for you to actually learn from them. Mm-hmm. I often use the analogy, it's like riding a bike. I can tell you how to do it. I can get on a bike and I can ride around. But you getting on the bike is entirely different.
That's true.
So,
well, we are so glad that you got on the bike and that you became so expert at painting and instructing and teaching watercolor, being a brilliant watercolorist. You've been an inspiration to me, I think an inspiration to a lot of people, And I just want to acknowledge you for that, because sometimes we don't get the acknowledgement we deserve, and you have become an absolutely brilliant watercolorist, and I commend you for that. That's not an easy task.
Thank you very much, Eric, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
Terrific. Well, our guest today has been Shelley Pryor, and you've been watching Interview with the Artists. I'm Eric Rhodes. Thank you for watching. Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview with Shelley Pryor. The video is called Painting Pet Portraits in Watercolor. You can learn more about it at painttube.tv. And remember, we have that discount code for you up in the comments section. I'm Eric Rhodes. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm Shelley Pryor, and welcome to my workshop. Today we'll be painting a watercolor cat. In this video, I'll be teaching you how to create a very soft, out-of-focus background, save very fine white whiskers, and create the soft effect of fur. I'll be showing my two-brush technique to create softness with control. I'll help you solve the challenge of getting the right values with a simple homemade tool. I noticed that a lot of beginners worry too much about the details. I'm going to show you how to simplify that process. The struggle I see that many artists have is that they treat the entire painting with the same attention. I'm going to show you ways to soften some areas to allow the eye to flow more easily through the whole painting. If you're having trouble with soft textures or creating realism, this video is for you. This will inspire students to build layers at a comfortable pace. So join me as we paint this cat in the sun using soft texture and detail.